Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Heather Campion, CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all my library and foundation colleagues, I welcome you here this evening. And I want to acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. Whenever introducing a film, I realize I am in part playing the role of the previews that we're all subjected to in theaters these days. I don't know about you, but I generally enjoy the first couple and then get fatigued as they go on and on. So I promise to be brief and to alert you that there will only be 2 brief previews before tonight's feature presentation. We're so pleased to once again be hosting a Boston premiere of one of Rory Kennedy's extraordinary films. Others we have been honored to show in this hall include Pandemic, Facing AIDS, The Fence, and Ethel. As the founder and president of Moxie Firecracker Films, Rory Kennedy's award-winning documentaries cover an array of issues ranging from poverty to politics to human rights, and remind us of the passion and determination of her father, Robert F. Kennedy, who showed as an international and visionary leader who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. She also brings to her projects a sense of her mother, Ethel Kennedy's zeal and good humor, and of course her own talents and artistry that make each of her films so breathtakingly unique. Immediately following the film, Rory will engage in a conversation with Jonathan Karl, the chief White House correspondent for ABC News. Throughout his wide-ranging career, Mr. Karl has covered U.S. politics, foreign policy, and the military, and has earned some of the most prestigious honors in journalism. We thank him for traveling here from Washington, D.C. tonight to be with us. Finally, we're so proud to partner this evening with the flagship PBS history series, American Experience, which will air this Oscar-nominated Last Days in Vietnam on April 28th, nationally on PBS and locally on WGBH. Past American Experience films we have shown here include the fascinating documentary Freedom Riders, and most recently, the Emmy Award-winning film on JFK, which featured many of the photos and films housed in this library. So I'm especially pleased to introduce to you now the executive producer of American Experience, Mark Samuels. Prior to joining WGBH, Mr. Samuels worked as an independent documentary filmmaker and as executive producer for several U.S. public television stations. Under his leadership, American Experience films have been honored with nearly every industry award. Please join me now in welcoming Mark Samuels to introduce tonight's film.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for coming out tonight. Tonight's a really special night. It's a Boston proud night, I can say that. 2 great institutions, WGBH and the Kennedy Library, have come together to celebrate a film and a TV series whose sole corporate sponsor is also another Boston institution, Liberty Mutual Insurance. And on top of that, we've managed to bring a Kennedy home to Boston. My friend and the director and producer of Last Days of Vietnam, Rory Kennedy. This film has been 3 years in the making. When we conceived of the story at WGBH and reached out to Rory to realize it as a film, we knew it had the potential to be powerful, but our hopes have been exceeded by a long shot. Since its premiere at the Sundance Film Festival in 2014, Last Days has been a transformative event for everyone involved, taking us all the way to the red carpet at the Oscars this year. We've screened the film across the country at festivals, community organizations, PBS member stations, and at military bases, including the military Marine Barracks in Washington. What's been so moving are the stories shared by audience members, especially veterans who served in Vietnam and Vietnamese refugees and their children, who have now begun a dialogue, many for the first time, about those harrowing days and the journey to America. Those stories are now part of what we call the First Days Story Project, an ambitious oral history archive which launches tomorrow on our website at pbs.org/firstdays. Before we roll the film, I want to acknowledge two groups who may, I think, are in attendance in the audience. First, I'd like any Vietnam veterans to stand up, please. Thank you. Thank you for your service. And I'd also like any Vietnamese Americans who are here with us tonight to stand up, please. And now we're going to see how those two groups have a story that they share and are intertwined so powerfully in Rory's film. So I hope you enjoy the film, hope you stick around for the conversation afterwards, and thanks again for coming.
Wow. Wow. So I'm Jonathan Carl with ABC News, and this, of course, is Rory Kennedy, producer of that masterpiece.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
So, Rory, I've got to tell you, I've been a fan of your work for a long time. Of course, Ethel, the work about your mother is incredible. Helen Thomas, you've even done so many incredible documentaries. You've really put together quite a list. When you told me you were doing this, I was skeptical. You were going to do a documentary about Vietnam. I mean, this is a subject that has been done many, many times from many different angles. And I thought, how is Rory Kennedy going to come up with something new to say about Vietnam? And you did.
Well, you know, it's funny that you say that because I had been approached by Mark Samuels, who was here and who helped introduce this evening's program, and he's the executive at American Experience Television. He approached me and said, do you want to do a film about the final days of Vietnam? And I had the same response, which was, I've always been fascinated with Vietnam. I feel that it's a seminal moment in our nation's history. I felt connected to it. As I'm sure many people here know, my father, Robert Kennedy, ran his last campaign in 1968 because he wanted us to get out of Vietnam. But I felt like so much had been done, and would I be able to add anything new to it, to our understanding? And then I started doing research and learning about the events. You know, we all, I think, know about that iconic image of the helicopter on top of what we thought was the embassy. It's not even the embassy. And I was blown away by how little I knew and how, you know, stunning these events were, and how important they were, and how timely this story seemed. You know, we were, at that time, this was 2 years ago, on the brink of, we thought on the brink of trying to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan. I felt there were so many lessons to be learned in understanding these final events. But we've now shown this film. It premiered at Sundance a year ago, and it's had an extensive theatrical life and festival life. It's been really wonderful, but the dominant response from audiences is, I can't believe we don't know this story. Yeah. I can't believe I don't know this story. And there's a sense of, you know, people who are historians, people who were in Vietnam. I remember when we premiered this at Sundance, and the people who were in the film were seeing it for the first time, and they said, we had no idea what was going on in all of these other locations. You know, so it really feels like it is offering something, you know, and it's been such an honor for me to tell this story, because it does feel like it is offering new information and a new kind of chapter in our understanding of this war.
And you have so many compelling characters in this story. One of them is Richard Armitage, who organized, you know, getting all those people out on the ships. And you told me something fascinating, which is, so Armitage plays this central role, basically helps save 30,000 people. And you received an email from his son.
I did. I received an email. The film had premiered in Washington this fall. And after that, I received an email from Armitage's son saying, thank you so much for making this film. I never knew this story about my father. And, I always, I had the sense that Armitage was kind of a quiet man that didn't boast. But I think if I saved 30,000 people, my children would know.
And, what you've done is you've told this story, but the other thing that blows me away as somebody in television is that this historic period that was covered so thoroughly by news organizations and has been done so many times since, you actually got new film, new footage. I don't know if you all realize this, but that unbelievable footage from the Kirk pushing over the helicopters, the footage at the end with the flag going up, that had never been seen before.
Well, we were very lucky with that footage in particular because I had a wonderful archive team that went into the archives of ABC, NBC, CBS, and we really tried to get new material that people hadn't seen. But you're working with these news organizations, and there definitely is some footage in there that people have seen before. But I was then at a screening in Washington of my previous film, Ethel, which I also showed here at the museum a couple years ago, and I was talking to a guy who had helped uncover the story of the USS Kirk, and I said that I really want to profile the Kirk in this film, and he came up to me later on in the evening and said, I was thinking what you were saying, and I talked to this sailor who was on the Kirk about 4 months ago, and he had mentioned he had gone up to his attic and found a box of Super 8 footage from the Kirk in 1975. Would you have any interest in that?
Nah.
I said, yes. So I got the guy's number, Dan Lucero, and I called him at like 9:05 the next morning because I didn't want to be desperate. And he was very protective of the footage. I was then out in California, and he wouldn't FedEx it. He wouldn't, I gave him a FedEx number, and he wouldn't FedEx it out. So I sent him an airplane ticket. And I flew him out, and he carried it out on his lap, this footage. And anyway, we went and we transferred it, and it was a treasure trove. So exactly right, all of the footage of the helicopters being pushed over is his footage. The story of the Chinook, which is such an extraordinary moment, is his footage. The moving images there, all of the footage during the Armitage sequence of those ships that are overcrowded with Vietnamese, which is such a profound moment to me because there are all of these people who have the shirt on their back who have lost their country and they've lost everything. It's so profound. And the raising and the lowering of the South Vietnamese flag, and when they're singing their anthem, that's all his footage that's never been seen before.
And there's something beautiful about the footage. I mean, the graininess, the quality. I mean,
I love it projected, because you can really see how old it is and authentic.
And the incredible thing about the scene on the Kirk is you're seeing the images, which are so powerful. And in a documentary, you go back and you interview people that were there, and they're talking years later. But you have contemporaneous account of what was going on because you have these audio letters that were sent back home.
Hugh Doyle, yeah,
I mean,
which was great.
I mean, in real time, he's describing this at the time.
He didn't, I know, and I mean, we take this for granted today where everybody has their iPhones
Right.
and everything, but it was so unusual back then, and to be able to, come across those audio tapes and that footage and be able to incorporate it in the film, I think it really, when I was reading about these events, I felt like they were I think more so than any film that I have made, it felt that it was inherently dramatic, and it felt like it had the potential to really transport people to feel like it was a thriller as these events unfolded, particularly those last 24 hours. And so, I really wanted to make a film that had audiences have that sensation. And one of the decisions we made was to not have a narrator and to not have any historians or experts who are in the film, people looking back. We had many historians who fact-checked it.
Yeah.
But, and to have people tell the story and have the audience only know what they knew at the moment that they're talking. and not to give any other information. And so, you know, these elements, like the audio tapes and the footage, allow audiences to go back and really experience it as it's unfolding.
And I mean, Stuart Harrington is seen kind of throughout the film, and in many ways fills in some of the gaps that you would have had a narrator do. When did you have, first of all, did you have any idea that he was such a compelling teller of this story when you started
I really
this project?
didn't. He had written a book about some of these events, and I had seen a short clip of him from a news piece that he had done from a Canadian news source. And I was attached to him because he kind of touched on all the story points that I wanted to make in the film. He was involved in the Black Ops. He was at the airport when it was bombed. He then moved on to the embassy, and he was there throughout that evening. And then, of course, he had that extraordinary moment of having to leave the 420 people behind. And so, you know, I felt like he could certainly play a significant role. But the time I approached him, we had been editing the film, and I had probably interviewed 85% of the people we were including in the film. And we had kind of a skeleton of what the film was going to look like. And so he played a really important role because he helped marry all of these events and helped take us from one event to another very, again, organically. You know, he was very embedded in the story. And so most of the interviews probably took an hour and a half or so. I think I sat with him for about 4.5 hours, the poor guy. But he was so, and he's, you know, beyond being at these events, he's so well-spoken and articulate, and not just in terms of explaining what happened, but he is poetic. You know,
Yeah.
He has reflected, and you feel the depth of his character.
Well, you get a sense that he's heroic in the film, but he's also the person that told those 420 Vietnamese that he was going to get them out, and he had to leave. He had to leave them behind.
You know, it's when the film premiered at Sundance, as I had mentioned, many of the people from the film came to that premiere, and it was the first time any of them had seen the film. And it was the first time I had seen it, you know, with an audience. And so in any case, for the people who had seen it, it was very emotional. And I invited them all up on stage, and it was a theater, it probably sat 800 people. And there was a standing ovation at the end, and it was a very emotional moment. They all came up on stage. And during the question and answer, somebody asked Stu Harrington about that moment of leaving one of the 420 behind. And on the stage was Ben Pho, who was one of the 420 left behind. And so Stu Harrington talked about how he was plagued with guilt his whole, you know, ever since these events of having left these people and what happened to them and how could he do this and should he have stayed, and, you know, he couldn't sleep at night, and he lived in fear of running into one of them. And then at the end of this, which was also very emotional, Ben Pho grabbed the microphone and he said, "Stu, I want you to know I forgive you." And there wasn't a dry eye in the house, and it was very sweet. And it's actually been a great experience with both of them, because we've been now to many screenings together, and they're very sweet with each other. And we were at a screening in Utah a couple days ago, and I was out because I've seen the film a lot, so I was kind of sitting out in the lobby. And
You know what happens, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
I know
okay.
what happens. Doesn't end well, but so Stuart Harrington and Ben Pho come out, and Stuart Harrington goes around to the corner, and to go to the bathroom, and I said, "Ben, what are you doing?" And he said, "Stu's going to take a leak, and I don't trust him." So they're very sweet. They're very sweet. And when when the film got nominated for an Oscar, you know, I was so excited about it, and wanted to extend an invitation to go to the Oscars to Stuart Harrington and Ben Pho. So I called Stu Harrington and invited him, and, you know, he was thrilled and excited. And then I called Ben Pho, and I said, you know, so-and-so is going to come from the film, and all these other people, and Stu Harrington's going to come. And he was thrilled beyond. And, you know, then he paused, and he said, Who would have thought 40 years ago when I was left at the embassy that I would be going down the red carpet with the guy who left me? So it's very sweet, and it's been a fun journey to be on with them.
Well, as a journalist, one of the things that blew me away about this is the way you went back and you found all these characters. You know, those that were left behind. That last Marine who's stuck behind the helicopter. I mean, it was just, what was this process like? Now, some of them had been out there, but how, there's a certain amount of like kind of shoe leather reporting that goes on to put a project like this together.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Mark Samuels had a number of the stories when he approached me with this, like the story of the Kirk and the people who were left, the Marines left at the embassy. And so then, and then there were a number of stories we filled in, but it was sort of then a question of, there were a number of books that had been written by people who were in the film. And so that was kind of a starting place for us, because there really hasn't, to my knowledge, been written a kind of comprehensive book about these events of the last 24 hours that kind of pull all these stories together. And so it was really, you know, it was kind of a hodgepodge of reading these various accounts and then trying to figure out what took place when and who was directly involved and who was authorizing what. You know, and it was complicated, and it was complicated to get to an understanding of really who was in charge. Yeah. And I think in part because there really wasn't a system at that moment of a particular person being in charge. So it took a good amount of research and reading to try to just understand the events. You know, ultimately we kind of did like a timeline that was on the board of our edit room to understand what happened when, which was also, you know, sometimes difficult to figure out. I mean, like when I was interviewing Kissinger, you know, when they had authorized the helicopter airlift and greenlit that, they said, okay, we need the helicopters to be, you know, at the embassy at 11 a.m. And they were operating on Greenwich Mean Time instead of Vietnamese time. And so the helicopters arrived 2 hours later than they were supposed to, right? So yeah. We're trying to figure those things out as we go as to exactly, was this Greenwich time, or, you know, and what happened where and what, anyway, so it was kind of a process. I think the books that had been written were helpful because then we had a clear sense of particular people's accounts, but even those were often contradicted by other people. So it was kind of a meandering and, you know, finally arriving at a film that, you know, is pretty rock solid, I think.
What's that phone call like? Hey, Secretary Kissinger, it's Rory Kennedy. I want to interview you about Vietnam.
Hang up. That's what it was like. Call back. He said no a few times.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And then, but he came around. He came around, and you know, he finally came around, and he said, you know, I'm not going to do a Kissinger accent. I was about to, but I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, come on.
No, I'm
We're
not
on
going to do it. I'm not going to do it in front of 400 people. And he said, okay, fine, I'll do it, but I'm only going to give you 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. And then we ended up talking for about an hour and a half. And I have to say, you know, he was 89 years old when I interviewed him, and he had extraordinary recall. I mean, down to the minute of who was where, what miscommunications they were operating on, what was happening at 9:47 in the morning, you know, where they were at 12 p.m., what information they were getting, how that information was incorrect and informed decisions that then had these implications. I mean, that 24-hour period, he knew by heart. And I mean, you know, I had been studying it and like deeply, deeply involved in the details of it at that point, and he knew everything. So that is a pretty extraordinary thing, I think.
But one of the fascinating things here is that so many of the people doing these extraordinary things on the ground are doing them absolutely in defiance of their orders.
Yes.
I mean, Richard Armitage is not doing what he is supposed to do.
No.
Stuart Harrington is defying the ambassador.
Yeah. I mean,
And the ambassador is at the end, and he's a fascinating character because in the beginning of the film you're thinking he's your villain.
right.
I mean, he's clueless. He's refusing to do what everybody sees needs to be done, and at the end he's actually
Kind of a hero.
kind of a hero.
It's a little Shakespearean.
Yeah, a little. Yeah.
I think it's one of the things I love about making documentaries, and it's probably different from the kind of work that you do, which is that you can really do this kind of in-depth character study, and really, if it had to be a shorter piece, you might be more reductive about him and your representation of him, but he was both. I mean, I remember reading when I first read about him and saying, wait, I don't understand, because he's not green-lighting the evacuation, but then he's staying, he refuses to get on these helicopters, and he's saving all these Vietnamese, and how does that work? And trying to really understand that, because it was fascinating to me. And, I felt like he was both central to the story that we were telling, and, it's interesting to kind of explore those kind of characters who are ultimately in these very powerful positions, people who are in government who have personality issues and how that affects the decisions they make. And, that's something that I think we struggle with all the time with our leaders, and it's interesting to explore that and kind of look at it on many dimensions.
So we see the baby getting dropped from the Chinook down to the Kirk, which is just the moment that blows everybody away.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And we did a little segment on on
you
ABC's.
should tell about this.
Well, we did a little segment on ABC's This Week, and we showed the interview with you, and we show that, of course. And George Stephanopoulos comes in, what happened to the baby? And then immediately gets an email from you.
I
You know exactly what happened to the
to
baby.
Yes, I had George's email, and I heard him say it on television, and I was like, well, I know what happened to the baby. And so I sent him an email saying, this is what happened to the baby, and this is the woman's email. And so then then you say what happened.
It turns out she's incredibly accomplished child psychiatrist. She lives in Portland, and I called her up and we did an interview. It was fascinating.
Yeah, and so
but disappointing, she remembered nothing about the incident.
That's why she's not in the film. But it was very sweet because they did a segment on Last Days in Vietnam on one Sunday, and then George sort of mumbles about, I wonder what happened to the baby, and the next Sunday they interview her, and they did a Skype interview. And it's so amazing to see her and to know her history and what happened. I mean, you can't really expect her to recall the events.
No, yeah. but one thing that was, so her father is this, unbelievable figure. I mean,
what a hero.
What a pure hero, and was also again just incredibly modest about it. And years later,
Yeah.
and, wouldn't talk much about it.
One of the amazing things is that there was no training for these helicopter pilots to go over the sea because the entire war was fought on land.
Yeah.
And so, they never went to sea. And for him to maneuver over that ship, which is moving, 7 knots, and
In
throw
open
his
waters.
children out. It's just such an extraordinary thing.
And you tell it very well, but those moments after that horrible crash into the water when he jumps out of the helicopter and you don't know, did he survive?
I know, and his kids are on the boat, and
Yeah.
his wife, and they're all looking out, and it's amazing.
So this is going to premiere, Last Days is going to premiere on PBS on Tuesday.
Yes.
And I understand that there is actually, there's a whole section of the film that we don't see here that's going to be seen on Tuesday.
Yes, the film on Tuesday is another 20 minutes or so. And so I encourage you all to watch it again. It's worth it. But it's a great story. Some of you may have noticed in the maps, there's a town called Can Tho, which is in the southern part of South Vietnam. And there was an embassy located there. It was kind of the localized embassy, and the guy who ran that embassy was told that if Saigon fell, there were 2 helicopters there, and he should get on these helicopters and go to the fleet. And so he looked around him, and at this consulate, there were a few hundred employees, there were their families, there were all the people he knew in the community. He knew they were going to be vulnerable, and he thought, I can't leave all of these people behind. So he ends up, about a week before Saigon falls, anticipating that it would, buying on his own dime 2 barges, because Canton was on a river. And he bought these 2 barges, and then he gets the call that he should get on these helicopters. He refuses to get on the helicopters. He goes down to the barges. He fills them with about 450 Vietnamese, and then the story is of them going down the river, and they have an extraordinary adventure and experience. And so you're going to have to watch it to find out what happens. But it's a great story.
Were there other things that you had to, painful choices you had to make in terms of cutting out of this? I mean,
there were. I mean, the reality is that there were many stories like the ones that we profile in this film. And, we made kind of strategic choices just to make the film work, to kind of limit the character choices, mostly based on the timeline we were telling. Mm-hmm. So it really primarily had to happen in the last 24 hours. And geographically, so primarily happen in Saigon or, out on the Kirk, and then Canton for the longer version. But so those were sort of some of the limitations we had. But there's a great story that I was very sad not to include in the film about a guy named Lionel Rosenblatt who worked for the State Department, and he was in Washington in April of '75, and he anticipated that Saigon was going to fall. And there was a policy then at the State Department and the US government that nobody could go to Saigon at this point. So he called into his office and said he was very, very sick and couldn't come to work. And he dressed up as a French businessman. I don't even know what that looks like, but anyway, he got on the last Pan Am flight from DC to Saigon. And he went to the embassy, and there was a friend of his walking out of the embassy, and his friend said, "Don't go in there. There are pictures of you everywhere, and everybody knows you're here, and they're going to put you in jail, and you really don't want to end up in jail in Saigon right now, so you got to get out of here." So he turned around, and he left, and he set up a black ops where he identified basically CIA agents who he had worked with, who he felt were particularly vulnerable if they were left behind. And he set up an operation with his counterpart there, his friend, and they got a little over 400 people out during the middle of April. Wow. And he got them out, and then he flew back to Washington. And meantime, Kissinger and other people had done press conferences saying this guy's gone rogue, he shouldn't have gone to Vietnam, this is illegal. And so he got back there, and everybody said, you're going to get fired, and you might end up in jail, and this is a really bad situation. And then Kissinger called him and asked him to come to his office. And so then everybody was like, "You're really in trouble. It's going to be really bad." And so then I was interviewing Kissinger, and I asked him about the Lionel Rosenblatt story, and I said, so then you beckoned him into your office, and and what happened? And then Rosenblatt said, "I walked in the office, and it was clear I was going to get fired, and I was really in trouble." And I said to Kissinger, "So what happened?" And he said, he walked into my office, and then Kissinger starts crying. And he said, and I told him he was my greatest hero. So.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Did the ambassador?
Let me just say one other thing about that story, because it kind of, it evolves into an interesting place, where then Kissinger said to Lionel Rosenblatt, "You can do and there was another guy who worked for Kissinger there who really hated Lionel Rosenblatt and thought he should get fired and go to jail. And Kissinger then said to Lionel Rosenblatt, "You can do anything in the State Department you want to do. What would you like to do?" And Lionel Rosenblatt said, "I want to be in charge of the program that helps Vietnamese come to this country." And Kissinger said, I don't think you understand. You can run the State Department. You can do anything you want. And he said, I want that job. I want to help the Vietnamese. And he went off, and he actually worked with Teddy, my uncle, who helped write the legislation, where there was basically an open door policy for the Vietnamese to come to this country. And they were, after they went to the Philippines and other geographical places where they took ships, the vast majority of them then ended up in the United States, and they would go to military bases in, New Orleans. There was one here in Boston, California in Orange County, Texas, some other locations. And then they had this wonderful program where they would have families basically adopt Vietnamese individuals and families. And almost every screening I've been to, individuals come up and say, oh yeah, my family adopted Vietnamese. And Teddy actually, I remember he used to have Vietnamese families out for Thanksgiving at the Cape sometimes when we were there. And anyway, it was a wonderful program, and it has been just, the combination of that program and the extraordinary character of the Vietnamese people has really contributed to their extraordinary contribution to our country. Now there are about 1.7 to 1.8 million Vietnamese who live in this country, and there's a big concentration of Vietnamese who live here in Boston.
And you've seen a range of reactions to people, from people seeing this, the Vietnamese who were there at the time, the people that are in the film, as you mentioned. What can you tell me about that? What's it like for them watching this?
Well, that's been just really, I think, the most rewarding experience for me in sharing this film. And, I hate to generalize about the Vietnamese, but I do feel that the overwhelming response has been very, very positive. I've had, so many older Vietnamese who lived through this, say this is the first time that they are able to really understand this story. I've had so many Vietnamese come up to me saying, I had no idea that any Americans tried to help us. And it's so meaningful to know that they tried, even though they could only help so much, that some tried to help. And others who have said, for us, for the first time, there's a sense that this country recognizes what happened and what we went through. And I think for younger generations, many of them feel like it's the first time they really appreciate what their parents went through. And they've approached their parents and talked to them about these events for the first time. The emails that I've gotten over the course of the last year, I'm like crying, and they're so emotional and poignant and powerful. And our story ends on April 30th, but that's the beginning of this extraordinary journey that so many of them went through. And we're now working with American Experience and PBS to initiate the First Days Project, which is recording many Vietnamese families and individuals who tell the story of what happened after April 30th and how they ended up coming to the United States. And I really encourage you to listen to them on pbs.org, because they're extraordinary and really remarkable.
And one of those who didn't get out and spent 13 years.
Dan Pham.
Tell me about you. He is not ready to watch this film.
Well, Dan Pham, so you may recall from the film, he didn't get out of the embassy. He went to the embassy and it was too crowded and he wasn't able to get out. And he had worked with the US government and had been promised and assured that he would get out, and then he didn't get out. And he ended up spending 13 years in a re-education camp doing hard labor.
13 years.
It's stunning. And anyway, he ended up in the United States, and I interviewed him, and it was a very emotional interview, and I think really took a lot out of him. And when the film got into Sundance, I extended an invitation for him to join us there, and he was very grateful and very thankful, but he said, it's too much, I can't watch this film. I just can't see it. And I called him today because the film's now on, and there have been a lot of other people in the film who've sort of been on this journey with us and come to different screenings at different times. And I've been in touch with most of them, but I lost touch with him. So I reached out to him today to say that the film's being broadcast and what a hero he is to so many people, and how he has helped people understand this moment in such an important way. And he said that he keeps trying to watch the film, and he'll watch 5 minutes, but he just breaks down and he can't quite get through it. But it, I think, is a reminder of what is at stake with this story, and what I think this film is ultimately about, which is the human cost of war.
Incredible. Well, I could talk to you much longer about this, but I think that's a great place to end. I do have one final question for you because of where we are. We're here at the JFK Library, and as a common practice here, the last question to all the moderators like me ask. And by the way, a great honor to be here. Thank you for having me come and talk to Rory about such an incredible project at a great place. The question is, JFK, what is, in your view, is President Kennedy's legacy?
Well, I guess it's, for me, a question of, his kind of legacy for all of us in this country and the world. And I think to me, his commitment to peace is really the most important legacy. And I know here now is the exhibit for the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think that moment, you really see and appreciate his commitment to keeping us at peace. And I think he had a deep awareness and appreciation for how important that was. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Perfect. All right, Rory Kennedy, thank you very much.
Thanks, John.